And then I will go ahead also and let everybody in. Is that okay with you, Rosalie?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Miguel.
Perfect. Excellent. I'll turn my camera off, but I'll be very attentive here. Okay, full house today.
All right, Pranav, why don't you kick us off?
Hello, everyone. Namaste from India. Good afternoon and good evening to all our friends from around the world joining this special session today. My name is Pranav and I represent the ONet team. I'm an environment and sustainability professional based out of Delhi. And I work for an environmental charity here. It's called Global Foundation for Advancement of Environment and Human Wellness. It is both an honor and privilege to extend my warm welcome to our esteemed guest speaker, renowned environmental activist, Dr. Vandana Shiva, to this session today. And to all our respected audience participants and my fellow members of the ONet community, warm welcome to you. ONet is a very unique forum. It is the open-ended network of stakeholders at intergovernmental science policy platform on biodiversity and ecosystem services, shortly known as IPBES. This voluntary organization offers a unique platform to the IPBES stakeholders and anyone interested in this issue of biodiversity and ecosystem services. The activities of this forum is driven by a core team called ONet Facilitation Team, of which I'm a member of. ONet aims to facilitate and maximize effective stakeholder engagement to promote the cause of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and information dissemination and knowledge exchange between its stakeholders and its diverse members from all over the world. Our current member strength is nearing 400, which is a great thing. In fact, we have almost doubled our member strength in less than 1 year's time. I'm really excited to get a deeper insight from our guest speaker on how food systems impact climate change, agrobiodiversity, women in farming, indigenous culture from this session today. This is our first session of this year, and I'm really looking forward to your wholehearted participation. So thank you once again for taking out time and joining this session. So let me now hand over the floor to my colleague, Rosalind, to take the session forward. Over to you, Rosalind. Thank you. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Pranav. Welcome, everyone. Before we begin, just to remind everybody to please keep your screens on mute so that we can keep the focus on Dr. Shiva. Also, just to let you know, if you have interest to learn more about ONet or to join, we have posted a link in the chat box for you to access to learn more. And also, if you want to learn more about upcoming events, be sure to check it out. Also, post a hello just to let us know where you're coming from today, and feel free to suggest future topics on biodiversity or any speakers that you believe that might be of interest for a future webinar. And of course, please post questions that you have for Dr. Shiva during the event. Okay, so let's begin. In the coming decades, IPBES food states biodiversity loss, climate shocks, and land degradation will place significant pressures on food and farming systems. How we view food security will begin to shift, including access to healthy, nutrient-rich soils, resilience to global disruptions. So we're very excited to have Dr. Vandana Shiva join us today, all in the context of speaking about food sovereignty and the state of our current food systems. So a little bit about Dr. Shiva. She is a trained physicist and did her PhD on the subject of hidden variables on non-locality in quantum theory, very heavy, from the University of Western Ontario in Canada. She later shifted to interdisciplinary research in science, technology, and environmental policy. at the Indian Institute of Science and the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore, India. In '82, she founded an independent institute, the Research Foundation for Science, Technology, and Ecology in Dehradun, dedicated to high quality and independent research to address the most significant ecological and social issues of our times, in close partnership with local communities and social movements. In 1982, the Ministry of Environment invited the Research Foundation to carry out a study on the ecological impact of limestone quarrying in Doon Valley, which became the basis of a historic Supreme Court judgment. From '82 to 1987, Dr. Shiva coordinated the program on conflicts over natural resources for the United Nations, which led to the path-breaking publication, Ecology and the Politics of Survival, and the Violence of the Green Revolution. From 1987 to 1991, the Research Foundation evolved with a special program on biodiversity conservation. In 1991, Dr. Shiva founded Navdanya Trust, an independent legal entity dedicated to conservation of biodiversity and service to rural communities. So for the last 3 decades, Navdanya has served more than 1 million members of local rural communities, creating awareness on the value of biodiversity conservation for both ecology and economy. Dr. Shiva is a biodiversity conservation pioneer, having contributed in significant ways to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity at the Earth Summit in Rio in '92 and its protocols. The recognition of Indigenous knowledge on biodiversity has been brought to the international consciousness through her books and conferences. In 1994, she worked with 100,000 locals in communities in Puttavam in Kerala to create the first community biodiversity register, documenting Indigenous knowledge. She has played a significant role in the evolution and implementation of the National Biodiversity Act. In 2002, and has continued to work with the National Biodiversity Board and state biodiversity boards. She is the president of the International Biodiversity Congress, a platform of biodiversity scientists from India and across the world. In 2018, Navdanya organized the International Biodiversity Congress in partnership with the Center for Innovation in Science and Social Action, the Forest Research Institute, the Uttarakhand Biodiversity Board, I hope I said that right, the Uttarakhand Council for Science and Technology, and the Wildlife Institute of India and Indian Council for Forestry Research. In 2000, she started Earth University, an international college and biodiversity learning center for sustainable living at the Navdanya Biodiversity Center in Doon Valley, in collaboration with the Green College, Schumacher College in the UK. Earth University provides a living learning center to learn from nature, biodiversity, Indigenous knowledge, and sustainable production and consumption patterns. Dr. Shiva combines sharp scientific and intellectual inquiry with creative and constructive action to create sustainable alternatives in partnership with local communities. She's equally at ease working with rural communities in India and teaching at universities worldwide. Time magazine has identified Dr. Shiva as an environmental hero in 2003, and Asia Week has called her one of the 5 most powerful communicators in Asia. Forbes magazine in November 2010 identified Dr. Shiva as one of the top 7 most powerful women on the globe. Dr. Shiva has contributed in fundamental ways to changing the practice and paradigms of ecology and economy centered on biodiversity. She has evolved creative metrics such as biodiversity-based productivity to measure the true productivity of ecosystems and not the reductionist one-dimensional yields of single commodities and the paradigm she calls monocultures of the mind. She has carried out deep research on the hidden externalities of linear extractive economies and shown the benefits to nature and society in living circular economies. Through her books, Biodiversity Conservation, Staying Alive, Ecofeminism, Making Peace with the Earth, Earth Democracy, Biopiracy, Stolen Harvest, Water Wars, Origins, and more, Dr. Shiva has made visible the social and economic ecological costs of non-sustainable development, as well as the path to sustainability. Dr. Shiva chairs the Commission on Future Food set up in the region of Tuscany in Italy. She's a board member of the International Forum on Globalization and a member of the steering committee of Indian People's Campaign for Fair Trade. She serves on Prince Charles' Expert Group of Sustainable Agriculture. She is a member of scientific communities of President Zapatero of Spain. She has served on the National Board of Organic Standards of India and has worked with several communities throughout India on sustainability through biodiversity conservation. She was invited by Prime Minister of Bhutan to help the Bhutan nation go 100% organic. Dr. Shiva has been a visiting professor at the Universities of Oslo, Schumacher College, Mount Holyoke College, York University, University of Luleå in Sweden, University of Victoria in Canada, the Université Libre de Bruxelles in Belgium. In 2011, Dr. Shiva was the Wayne Morse Chair at the University of Oregon in Eugene. Dr. Shiva has received honorary doctorates from the University of Paris, the University of Western Ontario, the University of Oslo, and Connecticut College. Among her many other awards are the Alternative Nobel Prize, the Right Livelihood Award in 1993, the Order of the Golden Ark, the Global 500 Award of the UN and Earth Day International Award, the Lenin Ono Grant for Peace Award by Yoko Ono in 2009, the Sydney Peace Prize in 2010, the Doshi Bridge Builder Award, the Calgary Peace Prize, the Thomas Merton Award in 2011, the Fukuoka Award, the Prism of Reason Award, the Lakshmibai Viranga Ghana Award in 2018, the Sanctuary Wildlife Award in 2018, the International Environment Summit Award in 2018, and the Amrita Devi, the Friend of the Tree Award in 2021. My goodness, such an illustrious background, Dr. Shiva. It's such an honor to have you here with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Rosie. I'm very impressed with your synthesis. There's so much I have myself forgotten.
Oh my goodness. But Dr. Shiva, let's start with a little bit about your background, because I find it so fascinating how you started in studying physics and how you shifted to really ecology and activism. How did that happen?
Well, it looks like a shift if you have a reductionist mind, but it is the same continuity as far as I'm concerned. I studied physics because at the time when I was studying and was in college and university, physics was the most foundational science. There wasn't a discipline of ecology. It just didn't exist at that time, not as a teaching discipline. But I've grown up in the mountains of the Himalaya. I've grown up with love for nature as part of nature. And I studied physics to understand nature. And it's that seeking that took me all the way to understand quantum theory, because mechanistic physics was very, not just dissatisfying, but so out of sync with the real world. And I lived in a real world. I wasn't studying nature and physics as a career. I was studying it as a system of inquiry. And so what quantum theory taught me about non-separation, non-locality, potential, all of those principles are principles of ecology. And therefore, when I saw the forest disappear and I saw this women's movement emerge called Chipko, where women came out to hug the trees, I decided to volunteer. So I went, at the same time, I went to 2 universities. And that's why I believe so much in multifunctionality. The way of nature is multifunctionality. The way of biodiversity is multifunctionality. So I'd do my PhD work in Canada, and I'd come back for my holidays for winter and summer to volunteer for Chipko, but also attend informally the Chipko University of Biodiversity. I learned everything. I mean, I loved biodiversity, but I learned biodiversity from the women of Chipko. So for me, it is really just different facets of the same seeking. And for me, knowledge and action are not separable. To just gain knowledge without responsibility to act, to do the right thing according to the knowledge you have gained is plain irresponsibility. So, for me, these are just different facets. And then as the challenges grew, I had to shed what was my passion, the study of quantum theory, and give more of my life to the study of nature, protection of biodiversity, But like I said, the same principles apply to living systems as they do to quantum theory. And I have a very dear friend who's no more. She died of cancer, May Wan Ho, and she came to meet me years ago, and she was writing a book on the quantum physics of living systems. And she said, I just want you to check on the quantum part of it. And it's a book everyone should read. It's called The Rainbow and the Worm. It's a biodiversity book, but it's a quantum theory book, yeah? And the two go together very intimately.
Well, fantastic. Thank you. Well, definitely the preservation of nature, I think, is a higher calling, and so inspired to have you leading the way here. So let's jump kind of right in then with some of the questions. In the documentary Dirt, as well as some of your writings, you talk about monocultures and really how they don't really produce more, but they actually produce less. Monocultural farming produces primarily now rice, corn, wheat, and soy, prioritizing productivity over the concerns of nutrition, biodiversity, and soil health. We have essentially ended production of more diverse crops to meet the needs of these commodity markets. But in doing so, we're contributing to climate change and biodiversity decline. The IPBES global assessment states fewer and fewer varieties and breeds of plants and animals are being cultivated and raised around the world, despite efforts by indigenous peoples and local communities. So from a food sovereignty perspective, how can the preservation of indigenous culture and seeds and interplanting limit really the decline in soil health and improve agrobiodiversity?
Well, like I said, my journey on biodiversity started with the Chipko movement. And part of what the Chipko movement was responding to was, of course, deforestation, but also the conversion of natural mixed forests to monocultures of commercial species. And the impacts are the same, The cycle of nutrition is broken, the cycle of water is broken, you still have floods, you still have droughts. And the women were rising against the monocultures in the mountains of pine. I then did a study on the monoculture of eucalyptus when I was in Bangalore at the Institute of Science and later at the Institute of Management. And then in '84, when multiple crises took place in India, the Bhopal disaster where pesticide plant killed thousands, the Punjab uprisings, 30,000 people died. That's when, under the United Nations University Program on Conflicts over Resources, I said to the university, I think I must look at what's going on. Here are conflicts, but what are their roots? So that's when I wrote The Violence of the Green Revolution. And then I realized that the Green Revolution was A, the introduction of chemicals. Two, to introduce chemicals, you must have monocultures because biodiverse systems are synergetic systems. They're symbiotic systems. They have internal inputs, yeah? The corn will be nourished with nitrogen from the bean. And all systems of agriculture have had cereals, pulses and beans, and oil seeds and vegetables, always. They've never been monocultures. The Three Sisters in North America, the Milpa system in Mexico, Navdanya, which means 9 crops together, are all systems where the biodiversity provides everything that agriculture needs. It provides the pest control, it provides the weed control, it provides the nutritional cycles, it provides climate resilience. You never have a failure in a biodiverse system. Now, why do you move to monocultures? Because you have to have an external input from fossil fuel-based chemicals. The chemicals need monocultures. And monocultures then destroy biodiversity, the soil and climate simultaneously. And they also create hunger because, like you mentioned, they're producing less of nutrition per acre. And that's why we started to measure biodiversity per acre, nutrition per acre, biodiversity-based productivity. And our research has shown that biodiversity-intensive systems can provide enough nutrition for 2 times India's population while conserving biodiversity. So biodiversity conservation can be an answer to hunger and malnutrition, but it is also the answer to climate change, because what is climate change? Climate change is ignoring the functions of biodiversity, trying to substitute them with fossil fuels, in the process doing 2 harms: the destruction of biodiversity on the one hand, and the pollution of greenhouse gas emissions on the other. Now, when you shift to biodiversity, you shift to biodiversity intensive agriculture, you shift to ecological farming, what you do is you heal the broken cycles, because at the end of it, climate change is a rupture of the species diversity, but it is also the rupture of the carbon cycle, because it's not the case that the earth doesn't have ways to reabsorb carbon, but when you burn fossil carbon, then that is way beyond the reabsorption capacity. And nitrogen fertilizers emit nitrous oxide, which break the nitrogen cycle. So at the end of it, chemical monocultures, industrial farming are really a big contributor to the climate problem and are vulnerable to climate damage. Every disaster I've seen, the monocultures collapse and the biodiverse systems stand. Maybe one crop gets damaged. This year, the pulses got damaged with too much rain, but the whole crop did not, and people did not have to starve. My book, Soil Not Oil, that I did on the lead up to the Copenhagen summit, tried to bring all this together because, ever since the Earth Summit, for me, biodiversity and climate change are two facets of nature. And greenhouse gas emissions leading to climate change and destruction of biodiversity are two symptoms of the same wrong-headed economics and wrong-headed science, technology, wrong-headed agriculture system. And at that time, I said it's about, if you add all the levels, you add the use of fossil fuels and fossil fuel-based chemical agriculture, you'll find it interesting that nitrous oxide as a greenhouse gas is totally ignored, even in the COP26 at Glasgow. There's like a conspiracy of silence on a greenhouse gas that is 300 times more damaging than carbon dioxide. And I can't understand why scientists would want to be silent on it. So the first is the production system, that is about 14 to 15% of greenhouse gas emissions. Then is the fact that a commodity-driven system never knows when enough is enough, yeah? A small farmer-based system says, oh, this is my 1 acre land. I will intensify and produce more from this 1 acre land. But when you're a commodity growing system, and it's a system, BlackRock as in fact investors, the Cargills as traders, the Monsantos as the controllers of seed and Roundup, together, they must invade into more and more and more forests. Forest destruction, that they call land use change, is 20% of the greenhouse gases linked to an agriculture model that doesn't know what limits are, that doesn't know what planetary limits are, it doesn't know what cycles of renewal are. Then you come to the fact that we've created such a messy food system that must first process food and make us sick, package food in aluminium and plastic, and mine more fossil fuel and mine more bauxite. I have worked with tribals fighting bauxite mines. So I know the full chain, working with communities and working in ecosystems. I know the full chain from a plastic package of food, an aluminium package of food, to what it costs the earth. And then you make it all move thousands of miles. And if you look at the debate during the lockdown, they're still talking about long distance supply chains, instead of realizing that we have to rebuild food sovereignty. So this wasted system that is resource intensive, is fossil fuel intensive, is 20% of greenhouse gas emissions. And because you've built the whole system on external inputs from fossil fuels, you've created monocultures, you've created uniformity. Uniformity creates waste. If you've seen the standards of health and safety, if the potato is smaller than the right size, it's thrown away. Half the food in America is wasted. Half the food. There's a lovely book called The American Wasteland. How from the production level to the transport level to the best before dates, you have another 4%. And that contributes also to methane because you're dumping so much food. And part of the whole thing is, animals used to be eating grass, they're herbivores. You put them into prisons and feed them beans, And a bean diet is a gas-producing diet. That's where the methane comes from, not from the cow. It comes from the factory farm. And there's this messy equivalence of different things. So add it all up, it's 50%. And my book, Soil Not All, makes these connections. But not just soil as soil, but soil as the matrix from which biodiversity grows. Yeah. Then the soil as an ecosystem that grows biodiversity versus an oil system that destroys biodiversity, destroys the climate. And show me an oil well, show me a frack site that does not leave pollution. It is very polluting, you know, and not just the greenhouse gases. When it's being mined, it is destroying communities. Look at the case of Chevron in Ecuador. I was ambassador for the Ecuador government to fight against Chevron. Look at the Shell crisis in the Niger Delta. Yeah, Ken Saro-Wiwa was sacrificed by, Shell had him killed because he was fighting Shell. So we are talking of a very, very toxic model of an economy based on oil. And here we have a lovely, peaceful, regenerative model of the economy based on biodiversity. That's where indigenous people have practiced. That's what they're defending. That's where the future of agroecology and that's where the future of regenerative farming is. So the two trends of ancient cultures that are biodiversity-based economies and the new awareness from sustainability, they are converging, and we need to grow this convergence.
Okay, yes, definitely. So you talked about the waste of food, which is significant. It definitely, I think some research that I looked at was 1.3 billion tons of food are wasted globally every year, contributing to as much as about 6% of global greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, you know, if we talk about hunger, it is increasing. When we talk about our food systems producing 4 billion metric tons of food per year, but we're wasting this much. You talked about the supply chain. Would a possible solution or even a possible thing that we should look at, should we shorten the supply chains to more localized food systems? And also, should we eat lower on the food chain by moving more foods toward plant-based diets and shifting agricultural lands away from feed grains to more food for people?
Yeah, yes to all your questions. Yes, we need to relocalize because a globalized system is a monoculture system. A monoculture system mismatches the laws of the earth and it mismatches the laws of health. As I have written in many of my writings, biodiversity is the health linkage. Biodiversity in the soils, biodiversity of the plants, biodiversity of species in an ecosystem, and the biodiversity in our gut microbiome. So biodiversity in our agriculture nourishes the biodiversity in our gut microbiome. That's what makes for health. Uniformity is the killer of the gut microbiome. Uniformity grown with toxic chemicals, the glyphosates, the Roundup, that is absolutely devastating health. And all you need to do is compare Europe and America in terms of the health condition. Just compare the two countries. What's happening? I mean, autism has exploded in the United States. And the CDC says 1 in 2 children will be autistic. And all the research is showing the second brain, our gut, is being damaged, which is what manages this brain. Yeah, that's why the gut is called the second brain. So yes, we need to relocalize. Yes, we need to stop wasting energy on processing food that takes nourishment away and creates chronic diseases. I definitely am very, very strongly against Silicon Valley trying to grab our food systems. You know, you've made enough, Mr. Gates, you've made enough money, all of you at Silicon Valley. Leave our food for the health of the planet and the health of people. Because the next big fashion is fake food. Yeah, and I have a book coming out on philanthrocapitalism. I think on probably February the 19th, it's going to be released. And it's coming out from Synergetic Press in the United States. So everything that's wrong with the food system, the monocultures, more fossil fuels, more chemicals, more processing, more further down the chain, all of that will be further intensified. And you're going to get food that's mismatched to our gut microbiome. And as is so clearly acknowledged by the big companies, that for them this is perfect. You know, that's why plant-based food is an inadequate description. You know, plant-based food processed how, through what energy requirement, how much artificial additives, how much untested process, like this Impossible Burger, which has 14 patents on it. It has an artificial blood, which has not been tested. Even the FDA says its properties are not known. Now, if I'm a vegetarian and I want plants, why don't I just make a dal burger? You know, why don't I just take mung beans and make a nice cake, or a chickpeas and make a nice cake and make a burger? We do that in India. Why do I have to take GMO soybean, which has killed the soil, which has killed the monarch butterfly, and then pour artificial blood on it to make it look meaty? Something has gone wrong with our ontological conditioning, our connection with reality, where we want fake instead of the real. The real of biodiversity. You don't want to be a vegetarian. There's thriving biodiversity. Eat the biodiversity. And now I've started working with communities and women. We just did a beautiful festival on the wild uncultivated foods. And, you know, people were forgetting them because we've always been told you've got to have Roundup, glyphosate, chemicals, you can't have food without it. Thousands of varieties and species are waiting to be eaten again. They were eaten. Now, another very false idea, particularly in industrial civilization and industrial thinking, is the idea that if you eat, you destroy it. No, when you eat biodiversity, you're conserving it. It's the only system in which you can have your cake and eat it too, because biodiversity is a multiplicative, regenerative resource. It's not an exhaustible fossil fuel resource. You know, it's not the case that if you use it, you're going to have peak oil. No, you'll never have peak biodiversity if you use it more. That's why in the indigenous lands, only 25% of the lands are with indigenous people. But that's where 80% of the biodiversity is. That's where the world should be looking at to learn how to live with biodiversity while having nourishment for people and having a good life and a good community and a good culture.
Absolutely. At Vandana, you have talked about creating seed banks, and that is also a very, it's an indigenous practice as well. So again, through food sovereignty, how can the seed banks, as well as sharing of seeds and turning back toward more indigenous farming or regenerative farming practices, how can that improve, I guess, really this ecological crisis?
Yeah. So Rosalind, how can something that cultivates the future ever be going back? You know, anything that ensures your future is a going forward into the future. Just so happens that certain practices of the past of indigenous people are future oriented, and certain practices of an industrialized fossil fuel driven system seems to be new today, but is obsolete before it's born. You know, look at the plastic culture that's been created. Look at the pesticide. You know, pesticides have never controlled pests. They've allowed the increase of pests by 1,200%. Pesticides create pests. They don't control pests. Biodiversity controls pests. And insects are not pests. The more insects there are in the ecosystem, the more they regulate each other, and you don't have to spray, you don't have to use poison. So let's stop using the word backwards. Let's start using the word future-oriented. Seed is the first link in the food chain. And so much of the industrialization of farming and the monoculture of the mind is based on a very false narrative of seed. And I have learned this since 87 when I started to save seeds. You know, my studies are quantum theory. I never studied seed. The seed has been my teacher since I started to save seeds. We have created 150 community seed banks in India and a global seed freedom movement to save seeds, to save seed sovereignty, because food sovereignty rests on seed sovereignty. Now, our work over these, whatever years we've done, I think 30 something years of seed saving, is that the old seeds are not primitive. You know, just like people were called primitive and colonized, our seeds were called primitive. That's the language they use in the scientific literature. Primitive seeds. Our seeds have more nutrition. We are doing research on this. You know, the yield of a commodity looks like it's 10% more. But when you go into the nutrition of that grain, it's 30% less. So you're actually losing 20% in the particular species. And then when you take it to the ecosystem, you are losing something like 70% of the nutrition you could grow if you intensified biodiversity. So we need to definitely begin with the seed, begin with the biodiversity of seed. And these seeds are nutritionally dense because people who were growing food to eat weren't going to be stupid, you know, they weren't trading. So when you're a Cargill and you're trading, you worry about volume and weight. For trade, what matters is volume and weight. For eating, what matters is taste, quality, nourishment. So we have a lovely little booklet called The Law of the Seed. We wrote it when in Europe, they were trying to make it illegal to save seeds. And the European Parliament wrote to me and I read this, and it was called the Plant Propagation Law. And I read it and I said, this is not about plant propagation, about seed. And did a critique, went to European Parliament, they made 1,200 corrections to that law. We did a seed pilgrimage from the southern part of Europe, which is the biodiversity rich part, from Greece through Italy, France. This is the area where they still have seeds. And we stopped that law. And during that time, we wrote a booklet for the movements as well as European Parliament. You can go to the Navdanya website. There's a website of navdanya.org in India, our work on seed here, and our campaigning on seed globally is Navdanya International website, where the law of the seed is available. And you will see there are two paradigms of seed. Yeah, one, you breed uniformity, you breed non-renewability, and you breed vulnerability. And in the farmer systems, you breed diversity, you breed nutrition, and you breed climate resilience. So in our seed banks, we have salt-tolerant seeds, we have flood-tolerant seeds, we have drought-tolerant seeds. And as the climate disasters grow, these seeds, which were called obsolete, are coming more and more into use by farmers. If it's drought-resistant in the dry areas, that's what they're using now. And after the cyclones have increased in the coastal areas, the salt-tolerant seeds we saved are spreading. And this is where the seed banks, community seed banks, become very useful, because here we have created community seed bank to reclaim seed as a commons rather than as intellectual property of 4 companies. You know, I think it's very dangerous to the food security, biodiversity, and seed security of the world to have the seeds of the world in the hands of 4 chemical companies. The Bayers and Monsanto, the Dow DuPont Silvecom Corteva, Syngenta, which was already a merger between AstraZeneca, Ciba-Geigy, and has now merged with ChemChina and BASF. Now, these companies have never cared for their biodiversity. They've never cared for life. And they're only changing seed to sell more chemicals. That's why seed saving, seed banks is absolutely vital, both for biodiversity itself and for our food sovereignty.
Absolutely. So some of the research that you have done, as well as Timothy Wise, has indicated that the green revolution in Africa hasn't really been a green revolution with this proliferation of GMO seeded crops. They did not really increase crop yields as they had hoped and as they promised, without really changes in unsustainable land use, deforestation, extensification, more water and fertilizer use, all of which have had devastating impacts on climate change and biodiversity. Meanwhile, a lot of our food systems are planned through contract farming, you know, possibly to the harm of many family farms and what have you. So how do we change this system? How do we stop subsidizing the more ecologically destructive farming, and how do we move it toward something that is more regenerative and not destroying our planet? Does it take the year-long protests, such as the farmers in India, or what does it take?
Well, I think that's a very important element, because what the farmers of India were fighting against were laws that would have decimated the small farmers of India, laws of deregulation of markets, laws of destroying the laws that regulate prices of food, and contract laws, where the corporations would decide everything, and there would be no legal recourse for the farmers. Farmers would just have to go to a corrupt bureaucracy to say, I've been cheated. But which corrupt bureaucracy will stand with a small farmer against a giant corporation who have anyway written, these bureaucracies have written those laws? And no, actually not. It was World Bank that wrote the laws in 1991, and I have so many books on this. 1991, our structural adjustment took place. 1/3 of the $90 billion debt was for Green Revolution. So yes, Tim has written a lot about the Green Revolution failure in Africa, but my 1984, research done in 1984, which became the book on the violence of the Green Revolution for the United Nations University, was about the failure in India. The Green Revolution got a Nobel Peace Prize, and yet farmers were rising in protest. So if it was so good for the farmers, why would they be so angry? They said, we are living under slavery. We can't decide what we grow. We can't decide how we'll grow it. We can't decide the price at which we'll sell it. This is slavery. Now, interestingly, when I wrote the book, I realized that the Green Revolution, there was nothing like green at that time. The green movement hadn't started. That started in the 70s. So the 60s, green was merely a color different from the color I'm wearing. It was a different color from red. And red was a troublesome color, in China, to spreading from China. And so the word green was given to say, well, you don't have to fight the red way. We'll show you a way through the Green Revolution to be prosperous, to have lots of money, to be rich. And that's why the farmers are very angry, because they got poorer, they got indebted. Their sons died. They have a cancer train leaving Punjab. And so the Green Revolution myth has been totally exposed, except sadly in textbooks, it's still taught, Green Revolution saved India from famine. No. 1942 was the last big Great Bengal famine because of colonial extractivism. It had nothing to do with production. It had everything to do with extraction. And then we passed laws and became sovereign. And there were no famines after freedom in 1947. No famines. Even 65, when the Green Revolution was introduced, was because of a drought leading to rising prices and a need for import, for regulating prices, not for saving people from hunger and starvation. So there's a narrative, we're living in a period of fake news, fake this, fake that. And the Green Revolution narrative has been very, very faked. And I think more and more research is now being done on indigenous systems and their productivity. More and more research is being done on agroecology. More and more research is being done on rejuvenating biodiversity system, and the very artificial competition that was made between trees and crops. We now know you need farm trees for hundreds of ecological functions. You don't want a barren landscape of line crops and monocultures over thousands of acres. And I think this paradigm has to change. For the future of the planet and future of humanity, this Green Revolution paradigm must change.
Absolutely. So what do you think about degrowth? Does agriculture need to move towards the direction of degrowth so that food systems don't push energy and resource use beyond sustainable planetary boundaries, but at the same time shifting more equitable resources and solutions to the global south?
Well, I'm actually doing a talk, I think on the 20th of probably January, for the University of Berlin, in a seminar on degrowth. And they just today, were asking me for the title, and I've sent the title, Grow Life, Degrow Greed. Okay, so the first thing is growth, as it has been defined in economics, is merely about extraction. How much did you extract from a system? How many trees did you kill in a forest? That is growth of the timber extraction. How many commodities did you extract from an agroecological system? That is growth. So growth is a measure of extraction. It's a measure of profits and commodification and commercialization. Whereas in ecological system, growth is a measure of how much ecological productivity is taking place. That's why I started to evolve the indicator of biodiversity-based productivity. So we need more biodiversity, we need growth in biodiversity, and we need zero, not just degrowth, we need a zero in poisons. We don't need GMOs. So a degrowth of the undesirable and the growth of the desirable. We've got to grow more life. We've got to do more photosynthesis. We've got to grow more biodiversity. We've got to grow more soil organisms. We've got to grow more insects, you know, and our farm is flourishing. We have 6 times more pollinators on our farm than in the forest. So actually humanscapes can actually be even richer than the forest system if you grow more biodiversity. Our farm, we grow 2,000 varieties of crops. We have trees, we have birds, and none of this is a threat. Of course, the birds will have a bit of corn, and our corn is particularly sweet. They're now breeding corn that is so lethal to birds, so they don't come and damage. But then that poison corn is going to kill us. Yeah. So we definitely need degrowth of everything that was wrong. We need less greed. We need less violence against the earth. We need zero fossil fuels and zero chemicals in agriculture.
Yes, it seems like what harms and what drives climate change drives biodiversity decline as well. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
All right. Yes. All right. Well, let's turn to our guests for any questions. Let's go to Paulina first. Do you have a question from the audience?
Yes, thank you, Roslyn. Thank you, Dr. Shiva, and good evening. We have as many as 71 participants joining us today from all different places all over the world. And they all seem to be very much inspired by your words and your actions. So probably action would be the very first question. We have participants asking, what is one simple act of change that everybody can make to contribute to climate change mitigation, food security, and biodiversity conservation? And do you perhaps know of specific initiatives, organizations, or movements that the young people could get involved with? So this is the first one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So, you know, as I mentioned, you know, my journey has been from quantum theory to biodiversity and now agriculture. Why do I spend so much time on agriculture? Because I realized that industrial agriculture is responsible for 90% of biodiversity destruction, 75% of water destruction, 75% of soil destruction, 75% chronic diseases, 50% of greenhouse gases. And when I say industrial agriculture, I mean the globalized trade as part of this system. So here we have a problem that is about 75% of all the life-threatening issues we see. And if I was to push it a little more, and IPBES did a very, very brilliant study when, you know, at the time of the pandemic, and they said this is about destruction of nature. This is about invading into forests. So we know that even the current pandemic has its roots in destruction of biodiversity. On the other hand, if you shift to a biodiversity-based system, biodiversity-based agriculture, biodiversity-based economies, I even say the biodiversity-based mind, you know, paradigm of thinking, not from monocultures of the mind, but from biodiversity, we regenerate the soil, and our soils are so rich in microorganisms. Our soils have 100% more carbon, 100% more nitrogen. We have more zinc, whereas the chemical farms have less zinc, and that's why we get nutritionally empty food. We have increased the water level 70 feet through many processes. Yeah, we are using less and we are recharging more. Organic ecological farming is the best way to conserve water. And as I said, we have so many insects and beneficial species and pollinators on our farm. So when you do the right kind of farming, you can, let me just share with you some rough data. So, you know, the calculations are that if you stop the chemical, if you stop fossil fuels, then the drawdown that we need annually for about a decade is 10 gigatons. But there are agroecological systems and biodiversity systems that have the potential, just expropriated to the world, they have the potential to pull down. You see, what we need is less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and more carbon fixed by the plants and biodiversity and into the soil. And we have the potential of hitting up to 180 gigatons of carbon dioxide drawdown per year, 108 gigatons. We are now doing a study with eminent soil scientists on how our biodiversity intensive farm is, of course, a biodiversity, Eden, but it is also a climate solution. When you wanted to know particular examples, look at Navdanya websites. I already mentioned them. I'm very bad at tracking and bringing things, to your chat books, but I'm sure Rosalind and the team can do it. Go to the navdanya.org website where we offer courses and where you will also see, hopefully sometime or the other, our dear Corona will say bye-bye. And sometime you will be able to visit us yourselves. But when you ask what's the one thing, given the figures I've given, don't you think the one thing we can do is change our way of eating? We can continue to eat in a way that devastates the planet and our health, or we can shift to biodiversity in our growing of food and our diet, and we can regenerate the health of the planet and our health. Now, that is not too difficult a choice to make. And usually they say, oh my gosh, solutions to climate change mean a sacrifice. Becoming more healthy is not a sacrifice, it's just the same action. So eating is the revolutionary act to regenerate biodiversity on this planet.
Thank you, Dr. Shiva. Pranab, do you have another question from our audience?
Thank you, Rosalind. Absolutely. I was going through the collection of the questions that we have received from various participants so far. One question that I would like to put forward to Dr. Shiva. In fact, I'm going to also add a little bit from my own inquisitiveness to understand. Dr. Shiva, you have been a flag bearer of seed bank, and something you have already mentioned. Your work has been able to save over 3,000 varieties of rice in India alone, and to push for endless, food sovereignty. So what would be your advice on actions for indigenous nomadic pastoralists for them to be able to adopt a new way of doing farming and to achieve food sovereignty in the context of changing climate? So, and I would like to also add a little bit to these questions from my own understanding. Food bank is something you have been promoting, but how do you push that, the need to replicate food banks all over the place in a country like India, which is so biodiversity rich? We need food banks in every corner of the country. We need biodiversity banks, kind of biodiversity banks, so that we can continue to promote indigenous crops. We can continue to promote our conservation of our rich flora and fauna. Over to you, Dr. Shiva.
Yeah. So over these, 5 decades of my activism and about 3.5 decades of biodiversity activism for agriculture, what I basically have realized is that people are forced to give up sustainable practices by all kinds of distorted incentives and subsidies, and very often threats. So when I started Navdanya and the seed bank, part of the threat was, farmers won't be allowed to save seeds. That's what Monsanto has said. I said, no, we will save seeds. And if you push these laws, we will not obey them, as Gandhi said for the salt laws or the indigo slavery. These were called satyagrahas, the commitment based on truth to not obey untruthful, brutal laws. So what do small farmers and pastoralists need to do? First of all, refuse to be criminalized. I've been helping the camel herders in Rajasthan because there was a big threat to them, and I'm so glad they've just won a big battle. They were being prevented from grazing on their traditional routes. The second thing I would say to them is retest your knowledge, test your knowledge, learn the best from the new sciences around you, but learn how to discriminate between a propaganda and science. And the third thing I would say to them is what Rosalind already talked about. Do we need to relocalize? Do we need to tighten the economies? Do we need to have less distance between producers and consumers? That's what we are doing with our community. And as during the lockdown, the communities who work with us had no problem with food, had in fact increased their immunity and increased the diversity in their gardens and their farms, remembering what were good immunity building plants. So we have to remember, we have to not forget that we are biodiversity cultures. And biodiversity cultures have had biodiversity knowledge. And biodiversity knowledge has included the knowledge of what is healthy, what is good for what, and what is nutritious for eating. That knowledge should not get lost. You had asked the second question, but just remind me what that second one was.
My query was, how do we?
Oh, the multiplication of seed banks. Right.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. So, I'm a follower of the philosophy that you have to be the change you want to see. And in the first few years, 87 to 91, when I actually founded the trust, I used to personally go village to village and do collections. And that's how I encouraged farmers to save their seeds and not lose them. And then I realized the erosion was rapid, needed more help, and I created the trust. And we created the first 3 or 4 community seed banks. And as people realize that these seeds will help me survive a drought, or this particular rice has so much more nutrition, or so much aroma, or this dal is cooked with no time, instead of a half an hour on the stove, it cooks in 10 minutes. All of these practices then become like tests and experiments. And that's how our community seed banks have spread. And people have learned. Just today, I was reading how, there are about 5 initiatives in Tamil Nadu of, they call them heritage seeds. And then they're linking it to consumption and heritage foods. So there are new initiatives all over that are taking place. And as every generation of the so-called improved seed shows failures, the Green Revolution has totally failed in Punjab and in Africa, as Tim Weiss has written. The GMOs failed in the first 10 years. 20 years of the GMO failure is all around. The Roundup Ready crops have created super weeds. The Bt toxin crops have created super pests. So it's over. Now they're trying gene editing again, which is not precise, which has all kinds of impact. So every step of distancing from truth, we talked about distancing of producers and consumers, but there's a distancing from truth, allows more people to wake up to the reality of the benefits of biodiversity. And I think that is what is happening. It's not out there in your paid news channels. It's not there in the big national newspapers, but it is a very big undercurrent. And I feel it when I go to the communities and I go to the villages. I realize the work I had to do 30 years ago to say the same thing has become so much easier because people have faced a very, very harsh impact of climate, of disease, of uncertainty and insecurity, and they are far more open to their own resources, their own knowledge, and solidarity.
Thank you, Dr. Vandana Shiva. One last quick question before we kind of end our discussion today. You talk a lot about how indigenous practices identify different seeds for different environmental conditions, whether there's flooding or high temperatures or drought conditions, what have you. So in terms of technology, what role is there for technology in farming? Is precision agriculture and artificial intelligence possibly like the next GMO for farming? Are we talking about really just ways to indebt farmers, or is it actually a way to help farmers?
So first of all, you know, I have lived long enough in the science and technology field to know that the word technology as an abstract without a description of a technology for what, using what resources, has only emerged in the last 10, 15 years. It's a very recent. Technology as an abstract term. Otherwise, you'd say a technology for doing this using these resources. That's a full description. Second is the anthropocentrism that has been the biggest enemy of biodiversity has creeped into technology. You know, the green leaf with the capacity to take the free sunshine of the earth with its photosynthesis, absorb the carbon dioxide, convert it into carbohydrate and food for us, and the oxygen we breathe. That is the most sophisticated technology there is in the world. We have to be able to see nature's technologies. We have to be able to see indigenous technologies. We have to be able to compare the clumsiness and crudeness of a carbon capture plant of $1 billion and the carbon capture of the sophistication of biodiversity and the green leaf. So one is we need to stop being blind to the technologies of nature and diverse cultures and privilege only the tools of exploitation of those who want to do the next. And first of all the research on gene editing has shown that it's not a precise technology. You know, for one genetic editing, you have 1,500 disruptions of genes elsewhere. This is not precise. You don't know which other, you know, it's not a word program where you cut and paste. You know, the scissors metaphor is so wrong. They did a whole thing in Australia where they got a robot to identify with lots of photographs. This is the weed and this is the cotton plant, and spray on the weed. And the poor robot sprayed on the cotton plant and killed the plant. And the weeds survived fine. So the projection of precision needs to be questioned. And the idea of artificial intelligence, again, is, you know, basically what is artificial intelligence? Taking some of the analytic ways in which we think, downloading it into a machine and feeding it back to us. That's all it is. It's machine learning of our learning of a very small fragment. So when we say artificial intelligence, we make it look like, oh my God, and all the writing, oh, it'll be more sophisticated than us. Again, let's come back to the sophistication of the mycorrhizal fungi in the soil. So intelligent. It can go 8 miles further and bring the nutrient that that plant needs. The brilliance and intelligence of a bee that knows how to travel miles to pollinate. I think the world is waking up to the intelligence of biodiversity. And I think we shouldn't get drowned by the noise of artificial intelligence, just like we got drowned by the noise of fossil fuel driven machines. And we got drowned by the noise of the idea of seed as a machine and GMOs. You know, the mechanistic metaphor hasn't been very helpful to humanity, and it has been a disaster for the planet. We need to turn to ecological understanding and to the recognition that we are part of the biodiversity family. We are part of an earth family. That's why I talk about earth democracy. That's why indigenous cultures talk about all our relatives. You know, colonialism, anthropocentrism, technocratic solutions, industrialism have all had their day. And we do need a new convergence of the ecological. We need a new convergence of biodiversity, of cultures, of species, and it is happening. It's happening on a very, very rapid scale. And your kind of networks, your kind of initiatives are facilitating it. So I want to thank you, and I'm happy. And I have put clumsily in my way in the chat box a recent article I wrote and it's available on the website. So it'll also take you to the website on Plants, Planet, and People, the link between biodiversity and climate change, and the recognition of the technologies of biodiversity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shiva. We will be sure to include that link in our email out to folks when we disseminate a recording of this video. Any last closing remarks? What gives you hope? What gives you hope in our food systems of what changes are to come?
Well, you know, like I said earlier, you know, I don't live in a Cartesian world. I don't live in a mechanistic world. I don't live in a world of the static. And therefore, of course, things are absolutely dismal. But hope is something you cultivate. Hope is not something you shop in a supermarket. Hope and happiness can't be shopped for. Hope and happiness grow by care and cultivation. So what gives me hope is every day I do what I need to do. I save the next seed. I defend the next farmer. And every day, those little initiatives, you know, and the other thing that the work over these years has taught me is humility. You know, we always otherwise be environmental, say, oh, how will I save the world? Oh, how will I stop this? And if you realize the earth is living and you realize the earth has tremendous regenerative power, then what you need to do is shift from mastery to cooperation. And the minute you shift to cooperation, you realize you have to be a little piece of the web of life rather than the violator of the web of life. And the minute you do your little contributions, things thrive around you. The soil bursts out in biodiversity, the plants burst out in biodiversity, your gut is so happy with biodiversity. So we do our little bit, we don't engineer biodiversity. We create the context for biodiversity to grow. Just like we create the context for hope to grow, we create the context to end hunger, to create resilience to climate change and solutions to climate change, and we become part of the regeneration of the biodiversity this planet gifted us. And we owe it to the earth and our future generations to not degrade it further and in fact work with it to replenish the earth. And it's doable. I watched it in my lifetime. I've seen it on the Navdanya farm. I've seen it on the farms of the farmers we work with. So I'm very hopeful. And that doesn't mean I don't look around and see the destruction. I've just written a book called Oneness versus the 1%. Some of you might like to read it. It's available in the US from Chelsea Green. It's available in India from Women Unlimited. It's my latest understanding of where the world is going. And then, of course, if you only think, oh my gosh, then it's all over. That's why you've got to start with a little seed. And in that little seed is tremendous power to change.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Shiva. Your talk, your activism, all your life's work has been so inspirational, and this talk has been fantastic. And so thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Rosalind, and thank you to your team. Bye-bye.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.